The Indian Wars are not a remnant of history. The Indian Wars are not a story of 500 years past. The battles continue today.
The land provides everything we need still to this day. Our food, our survival, our life, our culture, our spirituality.
Before the onset of the European in the 1500s, all of this continent belonged to the Indigenous peoples. We had our own governmental system in place. We lived in relationship with the land, and we were responsible for each other. In the 1500s, the goal of the Europeans was to exterminate us. That did not happen, so they passed a law to relocate us. People know the Trail of Tears happened in 1838, where 17,000 Cherokees were forced to march in the cold of the winter months, over 1,200 miles. 25% of them died. None was able to do the appropriate burial ceremonies.
In 1848, there was the Dawes Act, also known as the Homestead Act. This is the first attempt that was made to break up the collective system of the Indigenous peoples.
In the 1870s, the boarding schools were developed so that we could become white. The philosophy of the boarding schools were, in order to save the man, we must kill the Indian. The staff that headed up the boarding schools were primarily retired military people. They were abusive physically, mentally, emotionally, spiritually, and most often sexually.
All these stories are connected. So we hold that into our blood, we hold that in our body. It is our responsibility to break that cycle. And as many of the panelists said tonight, because we're here for the next 7th generation.
To try to contextualize Hawaii's history is to juxtapose it against Cuba. They were both sugar plantation colonies of the mainland of North America. In 1898, we enter U.S. history fully with the Spanish-American War, with the decision to establish a coaling station at Guantanamo and Pearl Harbor. Those two bases were the first and second foreign overseas military bases of the United States. They represented the time in which the United States went from being a colonizer on the continents of North America to being an imperial power overseas. U.S. Pacific Command, which governs military operations on half the planet, is located in Halava Valley. It's in the middle of a residential neighborhood. Hawaii is one of the critical launching points that allows the United States to continue to grow as a military power.
Across the ocean, there's a shameful war for oil and energy resources being waged by the United States government and by multinational corporations. At the same time, here in the United States, the so-called United States, there is a war for these same resources being waged by the same government and the same corporations.
We are affected by the mining industry, the oil industry, the timber industry, and the military.
When Bush said we need to get off of foreign dependence on oil, he pushed forth the U.S. Energy Act, which targeted tribal lands for energy development.
We're literally burning in Alaska. The ice is melting. There are literally towns that are caving off into the ocean from storms that are eroding the coastline. All of our survival is at stake. We're calling upon the U.S. to move towards sustainable and renewable energy development.
Our Navajo and Hopi communities are now working with Californians to build wind and solar plants that are owned by Navajo and Hopi people that will provide electricity to our communities as well as jobs. And that will also be a partnership with California so that the excess electricity can be sold to Californians. It will take all of us to think outside our category whether it's environmental justice, climate justice, social justice, economic justice, education, we must think outside of these categories. We must think critically and holistically.
It's time now that drill it all mentality must end now. We must give Mother Earth the time to heal and replenish herself.
Everyone stand up, stand up. Some of us grew up in India, Mumbai, World Social Forum. That's where our network and the Indigenous Women's Network and other folks met with the Adivasis, the first tribal peoples of India. And we learned about their history and their campaign to hold Coca-Cola accountable for creating water shortages and pollution. It's these Indigenous peoples of India, the Adivasis, that have shut down Coca-Cola's largest bottling plant in India.
When I was down with the Kuna women in the encounter of the Kuna people, one of the elders stood up and said, I traded with your grandmas. We bartered together. There was no borders there. What has happened is we've seen those borders, and those borders became in our hearts. So let's take those borders out of our hearts and open our hearts to one another.